I'm Rebecca, 28 years old. Just 3 hours ago, I sat in a courtroom watching my own mother attempt to persuade a judge that I was too irresponsible to manage my own finances. She wanted control over my bank accounts, my car, and even the apartment I had paid for entirely on my own. Her lawyer appeared confident, smiling as if victory were already certain, until the judge began reviewing my financial records. His expression changed immediately. His face turned pale. He stood so quickly that his chair nearly tipped over. Stop this proceeding immediately. Call security. Before continuing, tell me where you're watching from today. Share your location in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever felt betrayed by someone in your own family. You'll want to stay for what happened next. Let me take you back to where everything started. I was 7 years old when my mother decided I had become too difficult to manage. Rebecca is going to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a while, she announced one Tuesday morning. My small suitcase was already packed by the door. There was no explanation and no timeline, just a quick hug that smelled of expensive perfume and cigarette smoke. Then Mom climbed into her red convertible and drove away to begin her new life, the one where raising a child didn't interfere with her lifestyle. My grandparents' estate in Connecticut sat on 12 acres of carefully maintained land. The house reflected old wealth: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings worth more than most people's homes. Yet despite its grandeur, it became my refuge. Grandmother Eleanor managed the house with absolute precision. Breakfast was served at exactly 7. After school, there were tutoring sessions. Piano lessons were scheduled every Thursday. She had rules for everything: how to set a proper table, which fork to use for salad, how a lady should sit and speak. Posture, Rebecca, she reminded me frequently. Your spine should be as straight as your character. Grandfather Charles was gentler, though in a family where showing emotion was considered poor manners, that description was relative. On Sunday mornings, over pancakes, he taught me about business. Instead of discussing baseball scores, he explained compound interest and investment portfolios. Money isn't just about having it, he would say while pointing to his charts. It's about understanding it, respecting it, and making it work for you instead of the other way around. Mom appeared occasionally for birthdays and Christmas. She always arrived with expensive gifts and dramatic stories about her latest adventures. She swept in like a storm, promising quality time and meaningful mother-daughter bonding. But there was always somewhere else she needed to be: a friend's party, a new business opportunity, or a man who might be the one this time. By the time I was 12, I stopped expecting her to take me home. I had learned that home is wherever people genuinely want you to stay. When I turned 14, Mom enrolled me in an expensive boarding school. She described it as an incredible privilege, a chance to build connections with other wealthy families. In reality, it was another way to keep me at a distance while maintaining her image as a devoted parent. Ashford Academy will give you opportunities I never had, she explained during one of her brief visits, her manicured nails tapping against her phone screen as she spoke. The best families send their daughters there. What she didn't mention was that it also meant I would see her even less than before. Ashford was exactly what you would expect from a school that costs more each year than most people earn. Small classes, perfect facilities, teachers who actually remembered your name. But it was also full of girls who had grown up with the same emotional distance I knew so well. We were all products of families that had chosen achievement over attachment. I excelled academically because studying felt safer than forming friendships that might eventually disappear. Mathematics made sense in a way family relationships never had. There were rules, predictable results, solutions that worked. During school breaks, while other girls flew home to family vacations and exotic destinations, I returned to my grandparents' house. Grandmother Eleanor tested my etiquette during formal dinners, while Grandfather Charles continued teaching me about their business interests. Before I was even old enough to drive, I understood real estate portfolios, stock dividends, and trust fund management. Knowledge is power, Rebecca, Grandfather would say, while showing me spreadsheets tracking their investments. But applied knowledge is freedom. Mom's visits during those years became even less frequent. Sometimes she remembered to call on my birthday. Sometimes she didn't. Christmas cards often arrived late with short, impersonal messages. Hope you're doing well in school, sweetheart. The tone felt less like a mother writing to her daughter and more like a distant relative fulfilling an obligation. I graduated as valedictorian at 17 and earned acceptance to Harvard with a full academic scholarship. Mom arrived at the ceremony 30 minutes late, wearing sunglasses indoors. But she was there. She posed for pictures and smiled proudly, as if she had played a role in my success. "I'm so proud of you, darling," she said enthusiastically. "Harvard? Can you imagine? My daughter at Harvard." I could imagine it perfectly. I had spent years working toward it while she focused on becoming whoever she believed she needed to be that week. Harvard was the first place where I began to understand who I could become without constantly waiting for someone else's approval. Business school felt familiar. All those conversations with Grandfather Charles suddenly connected as I studied finance, economics, and corporate strategy. I approached my studies with the same focus I had always maintained. Graduating magna cum laude wasn't just an objective, it was proof that I could succeed entirely on my own. My professors noticed my dedication. They offered research opportunities and recommended me for internships that would have been impossible without my academic results. Meanwhile, Mom's communication became even more inconsistent. Birthday calls turned into birthday text messages. Christmas gifts arrived through her assistant, luxury items that were clearly expensive but completely impersonal. When I graduated summa cum laude, she sent flowers with a short note. "Congratulations. So proud." The florist's card was signed in her assistant's handwriting. But by then, her absence felt more like relief than rejection. I had learned to build a life that didn't depend on her approval. My first job at Morrison Financial began 3 days after graduation. I earned the position through my academic record, strong internship reviews, and what my boss later described as the most thorough interview preparation he had ever seen. Grandfather Charles had taught me to research everything, not just the company, but also their recent deals, competitors, and long-term strategies. Within 6 months, I was managing investment portfolios for clients whose monthly spending exceeded most people's yearly income. The work felt natural: pattern recognition, risk evaluation, strategic planning. These were the same skills my grandparents had been teaching me since childhood, now applied in a profession that paid extremely well. At 24, I bought my first apartment using savings from my salary and bonuses. It wasn't extravagant, but it was entirely mine. When I signed the paperwork, I experienced something new: full control over my own life. 3 weeks later, Mom called after hearing about the purchase through our family's financial connections. "Darling, how exciting, your own place." Her voice carried that familiar tone she used when she wanted information. "It must have been very expensive. How did you manage the down payment? Did Charles help you?" The assumption that I couldn't possibly achieve it alone was so predictable that I nearly laughed. "I saved for it, Mom," I replied. "It's called having a job." Of course," she said quickly. "I just meant, you're so young to be making such significant financial decisions. Maybe I should review the paperwork to make sure everything is correct." That was the first sign of the interest that would eventually destroy what little remained of our relationship. Grandmother Eleanor's funeral took place on a gray October morning that seemed appropriate for mourning. The Gothic chapel was filled with Connecticut's social elite, many of whom had known her for decades. They spoke about her charitable work, her elegant gatherings, and her dedication to cultural institutions. What their speeches couldn't capture was how she had shaped me into someone capable of standing independently. Every etiquette lesson, every correction about posture, every expectation that I behave with dignity, all of it had prepared me for a world that constantly tries to underestimate women. Grandfather Charles survived only 6 months after her passing. Doctors described it as heart failure. But after 47 years of marriage, I knew the truth. Some people die from broken hearts, regardless of what the medical certificate states. The reading of their will took place in the same law office where they had conducted business for 30 years. Mom arrived 20 minutes late, dressed in black Chanel and wearing an expression of carefully rehearsed grief. She had spent more time attending their funerals than visiting their home during the previous 5 years combined. The majority of the estate, the attorney Mr. Piton read in his calm voice, including all properties, investment portfolios, and business holdings, will be transferred directly to our granddaughter, Rebecca Alexandra Morrison, with the explicit condition that these assets remain solely under her control. The silence that followed was so complete that the antique clock on the wall could be heard ticking. "I'm sorry," Mom said carefully. "Could you repeat that? I believe I misunderstood." Mr. Piton adjusted his glasses and read the section again. Word for word, there was no mistake. My grandparents had left everything to me: the Connecticut estate, their Boston penthouse, the vacation house in Martha's Vineyard, investment accounts worth more than I had ever calculated, and controlling shares in their various businesses. Mom's face shifted through several shades before settling into a pale color that matched her foundation. "There must be some error," she insisted. "Charles and Eleanor would never do this. They understood family structure and generational responsibility." "Mrs. Morrison," Mr. Piton said calmly, "your parents were very clear about their reasoning. They believed Rebecca demonstrated the maturity and ability required to manage these responsibilities." What he didn't read aloud, but what I saw in the document he handed me, was their personal note. "Rebecca has shown more wisdom and integrity in her young life than some people display in 70 years. She earned this through character, not circumstance." The meeting ended with Mom requesting copies of every document, her voice tight with controlled anger. As we walked toward the parking garage, she finally spoke. "This is temporary, Rebecca. You're 26 years old. No one your age should manage assets of this magnitude without supervision." I looked at her carefully, perhaps for the first time in years. She wasn't worried about my well-being. She was furious that her parents had seen something in me that she had never bothered to recognize. "I'll be fine, Mom," I said. "Grandfather taught me well." She laughed sharply. "We'll see about that." For the next 18 months after the inheritance, Mom played the role of supportive parent with remarkable dedication. She called every week to check in. She sent thoughtful gifts without any special occasion. She even suggested we take a vacation together to rebuild our relationship. And honestly, I should have realized something was wrong the moment she started. Caring about my well-being was what she claimed. But the first warning sign was her sudden curiosity about my financial choices. "Darling, have you thought about hiring a financial advisor?" she asked during one of our phone conversations. "Someone who truly understands complex portfolios. I know several excellent professionals who specialize in inherited wealth. It's quite different from income you earn yourself." The second warning sign was her new concern about my living situation. "That apartment is lovely, Rebecca," she said, "but don't you think it's time for something more appropriate, something that reflects your new position? I could help you search for a place that suits your circumstances better." By the 15th month, her suggestions became far more direct. "You know, sweetheart," she said one afternoon, "I've been thinking that it might be wise to place part of the inheritance in both our names, purely for tax purposes. Estate planning can be very complicated, and you want to ensure everything is properly protected." I had observed enough family dynamics through my grandparents' social circle to recognize manipulation when it appeared. But I had also learned enough about business to document everything carefully. Every phone call, every suggestion, every gradual escalation of her interest in my finances. I recorded all of it in a file that would eventually become more valuable than I could have imagined. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning in April. When I walked into my apartment building's lobby, I found Mom sitting comfortably with the concierge, chatting as if they were longtime friends. "Surprise," she said cheerfully, as though unannounced visits were normal family behavior. "I was in the neighborhood and thought we could have lunch, just the two of us." Lunch, however, took place at an expensive restaurant where she had clearly made reservations in advance. So much for spontaneity. She waited until our meals were served before presenting what she called her proposal. "I've been doing some research, Rebecca," she began, "and I think we need to have a serious discussion about your financial situation." Here it comes, I thought. cutting into my salmon with deliberate precision. Inherited wealth carries responsibilities that, frankly, darling, you're not prepared to manage alone, she continued. The tax implications alone are enormous. Then there's estate planning, investment diversification, and philanthropic obligations. She paused, likely expecting me to appear overwhelmed. I think it would be best for everyone if I helped you manage these assets. We could establish joint accounts, implement proper oversight, and ensure everything is handled appropriately. Appropriately according to whom? I asked without looking up from my plate. According to people who understand these matters, Rebecca, she replied. According to family. The word family, coming from a woman who had spent 21 years treating me like an obligation rather than a daughter, was almost humorous. I'll consider it, I said instead. My grandparents had taught me that sometimes the most effective response is the one that reveals nothing. But internally, I had already made my decision. It was time to protect myself. 3 weeks after our spontaneous lunch, I received an official letter that changed everything. It did not come directly from Mom. She was too careful for that. The envelope was from Patterson Williams and Associates, a law firm specializing in what they politely described as family financial disputes. The legal language was complex and intimidating, but the message was unmistakable. My mother was petitioning the court for conservatorship over my assets, claiming that I was mentally incapable of managing my inheritance. I read the document 3 times. Each reading revealed a new level of calculated cruelty. According to the petition, I was emotionally unstable, financially inexperienced, and vulnerable to manipulation by individuals seeking to exploit my substantial inheritance. The irony was impossible to ignore. The filing included affidavits from people I barely remembered, distant relatives claiming concern for Rebecca's well-being, former boarding school acquaintances describing me as isolated and troubled, even our old housekeeper, who supposedly witnessed erratic behavior during my childhood visits. Every statement was either fabricated or severely distorted. Yes, I had been quiet as a child, but that was because the adults around me treated me like an inconvenience. Yes, I had focused intensely on my studies, but academic achievement was the only behavior that earned recognition in my family. However, presented together in formal legal language, those observations created the image of someone incapable of managing her own life, let alone a major inheritance. The most damaging accusation claimed that I had manipulated my elderly grandparents. According to Mom's version of events, I had isolated them from their loving daughter and influenced them against the family for financial gain. Anyone who had actually known my grandparents would have dismissed that claim immediately. Eleanor and Charles Morrison were not people who could be manipulated, especially not by a child or teenager. They made decisions based on decades of observation, not momentary persuasion. But the court wouldn't know that. The court would only see a carefully constructed narrative of a concerned mother trying to protect her unstable daughter from disastrous financial decisions. I called Mr. Piton immediately. "I've been expecting your call," he said calmly after I explained the situation. "Your grandparents anticipated this possibility." That stopped me completely. They anticipated it? "Rebecca," he said, "your grandparents were extremely perceptive people who understood family dynamics better than most. They knew their decision might eventually be challenged." What does that mean? It means they prepared for it. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There are documents you need to see. 3 hours later, I sat in Mr. Piton's office, reviewing materials I had never seen before. Medical evaluations confirming my grandparents' mental competence up until their final days. Psychological assessments supporting their decision-making ability. Detailed financial records documenting years of careful planning. But the most surprising item was a thick folder labeled Rebecca Morrison. Character assessment and competency documentation. Your grandfather compiled this over the past 5 years, Mr. Piton explained. It contained academic transcripts, employment evaluations, financial records, and even testimonials from professors and supervisors. It was essentially a complete dossier demonstrating my competence and character. I flipped through page after page. My Harvard transcripts, performance reviews from Morrison Financial, bank statements showing responsible saving and spending habits, letters from colleagues describing my professionalism and reliability. He knew this might happen, I said quietly. Charles Morrison was a businessman who planned for every possibility, Mr. Peaton replied. He loved you, Rebecca, but he also believed in you. This documentation proves that his decision was based on evidence, not favoritism. The final item in the folder was a handwritten letter from my grandfather, dated 2 weeks before his death. If you're reading this, it means someone is trying to take away what you earned through your character and capability. Don't allow it. You are exactly the person we raised you to be, strong, intelligent, and capable of defending yourself. Use these tools, and remember that the best defense is often a strong offense. I looked up at Mr. Peaton. The fear I had felt earlier was gone. In its place was determination. When do we respond? I asked. Mr. Peaton's strategy was systematic and relentless. Over the next 6 weeks, we prepared our case with a level of organization that would have impressed Grandfather Charles. Every document was cataloged, every witness statement verified, every piece of evidence carefully arranged. Your mother's legal team expects you to fold under pressure, Mr. Peaton explained during one late-night strategy meeting. They're assuming you'll be overwhelmed by the process, intimidated by the accusations, and willing to accept a settlement simply to make it disappear. I reviewed the growing list of character witnesses, former professors, colleagues from Morrison Financial, even the property manager from my apartment building, all prepared to testify that I was the opposite of what the petition described. What they don't realize, I said while highlighting a section of my employment evaluations, is that you don't grow up with Eleanor and Charles Morrison without learning how to fight properly. The discovery phase revealed exactly what I expected, and several things that genuinely shocked me. Mom's legal team had submitted financial records requesting access to my accounts. But in their attempt to prove I was incompetent, they made a critical mistake. They had also submitted documents showing their involvement with my finances. That's when we noticed the irregularities. Rebecca, look at this, Mr. Peaton said, spreading bank statements across the conference table. These transactions were submitted as evidence of reckless spending. But examine the dates. I leaned closer. Transfers, account openings, credit applications, all dated during the years when I was in college and graduate school, all supposedly authorized by me. All connected to accounts I had never opened. She's been using my name and social security number for years, I said slowly as the realization formed. Look at this credit card application from when I was 22. I was living in Boston that entire semester. This was filed in Connecticut. Mr. Peaton nodded grimly. Your mother has been committing identity theft and financial fraud for at least 6 years that we can confirm, possibly longer. But why would she submit this as evidence? I asked. Doesn't it prove she's the one acting improperly? That's the question, he replied. Either her legal team didn't review the documents carefully, or they assumed the court wouldn't notice the discrepancies. Both explanations suggested the same thing. They had become overconfident. Over the next week, we documented every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every account opened without my knowledge. The pattern was undeniable. Mom had been systematically using my identity to access credit, open accounts, and conduct financial activity in my name, while simultaneously building a legal argument that I was incapable of managing my own finances. The irony is remarkable, Mr. Peaton said. By submitting these records as evidence against you, she has effectively provided documentation of her own criminal behavior. But the discovery that truly changed everything came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the list of witnesses Mom's team intended to call, I saw a familiar name, Patricia Henley, Grandmother Eleanor's personal assistant for nearly 15 years. I need to call Patricia, I told Mr. Peaton. If she's testifying for Mom, something isn't right. Patricia had known my grandparents better than almost anyone. Our conversation revealed the real scope of the situation. Oh, Rebecca, she said with relief when I called. I've been hoping someone would contact me. I never agreed to testify for your mother. That law firm contacted me and asked questions about your grandparents' final years. I told them the truth about how sharp and capable Charles and Eleanor were until the end. But somehow my name appeared on their witness list anyway. What exactly did you tell them? I asked. I told them about the precautions your grandparents took in their later years, she explained. They had regular medical evaluations specifically to document their mental competence. They consulted multiple attorneys. They spent months researching how to structure their estate so the will couldn't be contested. She hesitated before continuing. I also told them about the private investigator. I froze. What private investigator? Your grandfather hired someone to investigate your mother's financial activities about 2 years before he died. He suspected she had been accessing accounts using your identity, but he needed proof. When the investigator confirmed it, that's when Charles began preparing for this exact situation. Do you still have contact information for the investigator? I asked. Better than that, Patricia replied. I have copies of his entire report. Your grandfather asked me to keep them in case they were ever needed. I believe now qualifies. 3 days later, I sat again in Mr. Piton's office reviewing one of the most detailed reports of financial fraud I had ever seen. The investigator had traced Mom's activities back nearly 8 years. The evidence included identity theft, forged powers of attorney, unauthorized account access, and even suspected financial exploitation involving elderly clients she had worked with professionally. This changes everything, Mr. Piton said. We're no longer simply defending against a conservatorship petition. We now have grounds to pursue criminal charges. But won't that make this personal? I asked. Turn it into a family vendetta? Mr. Piton smiled slightly. Rebecca, this was always personal. Your mother made it personal the moment she attempted to seize your inheritance through the court system. The difference now is that we have the evidence to make her regret that decision. Judge Harrison Mitchell had a reputation for operating his courtroom with strict discipline, punctual, professional, completely intolerant of legal theatrics. At 68, he had presided over every type of family dispute imaginable, and his expression suggested he had little patience for manufactured drama, which made Mom's appearance particularly miscalculated. She arrived wearing the carefully styled image of a grieving, worried mother. Subtle makeup, a restrained black outfit, an expression designed to communicate concern. Your Honor, her attorney began, his voice filled with practiced sympathy. We are here today because a devoted mother is deeply concerned about her daughter's ability to responsibly manage a very substantial inheritance. Mrs. Morrison had observed behavioral patterns suggesting that Rebecca might not be prepared to manage these financial responsibilities without appropriate supervision. I watched Judge Mitchell closely as Patterson, my mother's lead attorney, began his opening statement. The judge's face remained neutral, yet his eyes were sharp and focused. This was not a person who would be influenced by theatrical arguments. Rebecca Morrison inherited approximately $8 million in assets when her grandparents passed away 18 months ago, Patterson continued, gesturing toward a stack of financial records. Since that time, she has made several questionable decisions without consulting family members or seeking suitable professional advice. We are not asking the court to remove these assets from Rebecca, he added. We are simply requesting that proper oversight be established to safeguard both her interests and her future. The wording was carefully designed to sound reasonable and protective rather than opportunistic. If I had not understood my mother's real motives, the argument might have seemed convincing. Mr. Piton's opening statement was far shorter and much more direct. Your Honor, this is not a case about protecting a vulnerable young woman from poor financial choices. This is a case about an estranged mother attempting to gain legal control over assets she believes should have been left to her. The evidence will show that Rebecca Morrison is not only capable of managing her inheritance, but has demonstrated significant financial judgment since receiving it. More importantly, the evidence will reveal that the petitioner has engaged in systematic financial fraud using her daughter's identity for nearly a decade. That statement immediately caught Judge Mitchell's attention. He leaned forward slightly, his focus intensifying. Furthermore, Mr. Piton continued, by filing this petition and submitting certain financial records as evidence, the petitioner has unintentionally provided documentation of her own criminal activity. My mother's face instantly lost its color. Apparently, her legal team had not warned her that we might pursue this strategy. Mr. Piton, Judge Mitchell said in a controlled voice. "Those are serious allegations. I trust you have substantial evidence to support them." "Extensive evidence, Your Honor," Mr. Peaton replied, "including documentation compiled by a private investigator hired by the deceased grandparents specifically to examine these activities." Patterson stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly prejudicial." "Overruled," Judge Mitchell responded calmly. "Mr. Patterson, your client filed this petition claiming incompetence and requesting access to substantial assets. Mr. Peaton is entitled to present evidence regarding his client's competency and the motivations behind this action." He turned back to the defense table. "Continue, Mr. Peaton." The first day of testimony proceeded almost exactly as we had expected. Patterson called several character witnesses, individuals who claimed they remembered me as withdrawn and difficult to connect with during my teenage years. Their testimony was weak and clearly rehearsed, consisting mostly of vague impressions about my personality rather than any concrete proof of incompetence. More problematic were the financial experts Patterson had hired to review my spending habits since receiving the inheritance. They attempted to present a picture of someone making impulsive purchases and risky investments without adequate research. "Miss Morrison purchased a $70,000 vehicle within 6 months of inheriting," testified Dr. Richard Hoffman, an economics professor Patterson had recruited as an expert witness. "She also made several large charitable donations and invested significant amounts in what appeared to be speculative technology stocks." These patterns suggest someone who may lack the emotional maturity required to handle substantial wealth responsibly. At first, the explanation sounded convincing. That changed when Mr. Peaton began his cross-examination. "Dr. Hoffman," he said calmly, "did you research the specific vehicle Miss Morrison purchased? Well, the amount seemed excessive for someone her age." The vehicle in question was a certified pre-owned Tesla Model S with exceptional safety ratings and minimal depreciation, Mr. Peaton replied. "It was purchased after 3 months of research and comparison shopping. Are you suggesting that buying a reliable, environmentally conscious vehicle demonstrates incompetence?" "Not specifically, but the amount." "Did you examine the charitable organizations Miss Morrison chose to support?" Dr. Hoffman shifted his papers uncomfortably. The amounts appeared large relative to her age and experience. "Organizations that provide educational scholarships for underprivileged students and support elder care facilities," Mr. Peaton clarified. "The same causes her grandparents supported for decades. Does continuing a family's philanthropic tradition indicate financial incompetence?" "Dr. Hoffman, I simply meant that someone her age might not fully understand." "And regarding the technology investments you described as speculative," Mr. Peaton continued, "did you research the specific companies involved?" By the time Mr. Peaton finished dismantling Dr. Hoffman's testimony, it was clear that every financial decision I had made had been researched carefully and executed strategically. What Patterson had attempted to frame as evidence of poor judgment actually demonstrated the opposite. The real turning point, however, came when Patterson called his final witness, my mother. She approached the stand wearing a navy blue suit that projected calm authority. Her blonde hair was styled in a conservative bob that made her resemble someone's trustworthy neighbor. Her voice was steady and concerned as she described her growing worry about my ability to manage the inheritance responsibly. "I've tried to offer guidance," she said, touching a tissue to her eyes. "But Rebecca has become increasingly isolated and defensive whenever anyone suggests she might benefit from help or advice." "This isn't about money, Your Honor," she continued. "This is about making sure my daughter doesn't make decisions she will regret for the rest of her life." It was a remarkably convincing performance. I noticed at least one person in the gallery nodding sympathetically. If I had not known the truth, I might have been moved as well. Then Mr. Peaton stood for cross-examination, and everything changed. "Mrs. Morrison," he began in a calm, conversational tone, "you've testified that you're concerned about your daughter's financial decision-making. When did this concern begin?" "It developed gradually," my mother replied, maintaining her composed expression, "probably around the time she inherited from her grandparents." "I see. And before that inheritance, how often were you in contact with Rebecca?" A brief pause. "We spoke regularly." "How regularly? Weekly? Monthly?" It varied depending on our schedules. Mr. Piton approached the witness stand carrying a thick folder. Mrs. Morrison, I have phone records from Rebecca's cellular provider covering the 5 years before her grandparents' deaths. According to these records, you called your daughter exactly 17 times during that entire 5-year period. The longest call lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. He looked at her steadily. Does that sound like regular contact to you? My mother's composure faltered slightly. Phone records don't show the full picture of a family relationship. You're right, Mr. Piton said calmly. Let's discuss in-person visits. During those same 5 years, how many times did you visit Rebecca at college or at her apartment? That's difficult to quantify exactly. Would you say more than 5 times? More than 3? Even twice? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Mrs. Morrison, the judge said firmly, please answer the question. Our family doesn't express affection through constant calls or visits, my mother replied, her voice growing defensive. We believe in independence and allowing young adults to build their own lives. Yet now you're asking this court to remove that independence entirely, Mr. Piton noted. An interesting change in philosophy. Let's discuss your financial concerns about Rebecca's inheritance management. You testified that she makes poor decisions without consulting family members. When exactly did she consult you about financial matters before the inheritance? We discussed her college decisions and career path. I'm specifically referring to financial consultation, Mr. Piton said. Did Rebecca ever ask you for money? Did she ever seek your advice regarding investments or major purchases? No, but in fact, he continued, isn't it true that Rebecca has been financially independent since graduating from college and has never asked you for financial assistance? That's not the point. What is the point, Mrs. Morrison? He asked calmly. Why would a woman who has been entirely self-sufficient for 6 years suddenly require your financial supervision? My mother's face began to redden, her carefully applied makeup failing to hide the rising tension. $8 million is a significant amount of money. Anyone would benefit from proper guidance. Let's discuss proper guidance, Mr. Piton replied, his tone sharpening slightly. Are you familiar with an account at First National Bank opened in Rebecca's name in March of 2019? The color drained from my mother's face so quickly it seemed she might faint. I don't know what you're referring to. Allow me to refresh your memory. Mr. Piton produced a bank statement and handed it to her. This is a credit card application filed in Rebecca's name while she was attending classes in Boston. The application was submitted from your address in Connecticut and appears to be written in your handwriting. Can you explain that? Patterson stood quickly. Objection. This is outside the scope of this proceeding. The petitioner has asked this court to determine whether Rebecca Morrison is capable of managing her finances, Mr. Piton replied calmly. Evidence of fraudulent activity using her identity is directly relevant to both her competency and the motivations behind this petition. Overruled, Judge Mitchell said. Mrs. Morrison, please answer the question. My mother stared at the document for several seconds, her hands visibly trembling. There must be some mistake. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Piton continued, I have 14 similar documents spanning 7 years, credit applications, bank account openings, and loan requests, all filed in your daughter's name, all from your address, and all in your handwriting. He paused. Would you care to explain these mistakes? The courtroom fell completely silent. Patterson began writing notes rapidly, clearly trying to determine how to limit the damage. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, his expression no longer neutral but deeply concerned. I was trying to help her build credit, my mother said weakly. Without her knowledge or consent? Mr. Piton asked. I had power of attorney. Please present the court with this power of attorney document. Another long silence. It wasn't formal, but as her mother. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Piton interrupted calmly, there is no such thing as an informal power of attorney. Either you had legal authorization to act on your daughter's behalf, or you were committing fraud. Which was it? Patterson attempted another objection, but Judge Mitchell waved him aside. The judge was now studying my mother with the focused attention of someone who had shifted from observer to investigator. Let's move on, Mr. Piton continued. You testified that you're concerned about Rebecca's isolation from family. When was the last time you attempted to maintain a relationship with her outside financial matters? We've always had a close relationship. Mrs. Morrison, he asked calmly, when is Rebecca's birthday? The question seemed unexpected, and my mother's eyes widened. Her birthday? Yes. What date? I don't see how that's relevant. Your Honor, Mr. Peaton said, this is a simple question about basic family knowledge. If Mrs. Morrison is genuinely concerned about her daughter's well-being, surely she knows when her daughter was born. Judge Mitchell nodded. Answer the question, Mrs. Morrison. My mother cleared her throat. April something. I would need to check my calendar. April 15th, Mr. Peaton said plainly. Rebecca's birthday is April 15th. She turned 28 today. Then he looked toward me. Actually, happy birthday, Rebecca. Until that moment, I had completely forgotten. With all the stress and preparation for the case, the date had slipped my mind. But my mother had forgotten too, and everyone in the courtroom saw it. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Peaton continued, his voice now carrying clear disapproval, you do not know your daughter's birthday. You've had minimal contact with her for years. You've never provided financial support or guidance. Yet, you're asking this court to believe that you are suddenly concerned enough about her welfare to take control of $8 million in assets. He paused. Isn't it more accurate to say that you're upset you were not included in your parents' will, and that you're using this proceeding to gain access to money you believe should belong to you? That's not true, my mother snapped, her careful composure finally breaking. That money should have come to me. I'm their daughter. Rebecca manipulated them. She turned them against their own child. The sudden outburst shocked the courtroom. Several people in the gallery gasped. Patterson tried to signal her to stop speaking, but she continued. I'm their family. I'm blood, not some ungrateful girl who only visited them when she wanted something. Mrs. Morrison, Patterson began urgently. She turned them against me, my mother continued angrily. She made them think I was some kind of failure, and now she gets everything while I get nothing. That's not how families are supposed to work. Judge Mitchell's gavel struck sharply. Mrs. Morrison, that is enough. But years of resentment had already erupted into a stream of accusations and self-pity. Do you know what it's like to have your own parents choose a grandchild over their daughter? She demanded. To spend your entire life trying to meet their expectations, only to watch them give everything to someone who never had to earn it? Your Honor, Mr. Peaton said quietly, I believe the petitioner has just explained her true motivation for this proceeding. Judge Mitchell looked deeply displeased. Indeed, she has. Mrs. Morrison, he said firmly, please step down. The atmosphere in the courtroom the following morning was completely different. Word of my mother's outburst had spread quickly. The gallery was filled with reporters, legal observers, and several individuals from the financial community who had known my grandparents. Judge Mitchell entered with an expression suggesting he had spent the evening reviewing legal precedent and was not pleased with what he had discovered. Before we proceed, he announced, I want to address the allegations that arose during yesterday's testimony. He turned toward our table. Mr. Peaton, you have alleged systematic identity theft and fraud. These are serious criminal matters that may require referral to the appropriate authorities. I want to understand the full scope of these claims. Mr. Peaton stood, carrying several thick folders. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to call. Mr. Peaton continued, Your Honor, I would like to call Patricia Henley as a witness. Ms. Henley served as the personal assistant to Rebecca's grandparents for 15 years and possesses information directly relevant to both Rebecca's competency and the circumstances surrounding this petition. Patricia approached the stand wearing a simple gray suit, her silver hair neatly tied in a bun. At 63, she carried the calm presence of someone who had spent decades managing complicated matters for demanding employers. Her testimony was organized, precise, and highly damaging. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison began implementing specific legal precautions approximately 3 years before their deaths, she explained in a composed professional tone. They arranged regular competency evaluations conducted by several physicians. They consulted multiple estate planning attorneys. In their final year, they also had a private investigator to examine certain financial irregularities they had discovered. What type of irregularities? Mr. Piton asked. Unauthorized credit accounts opened in Rebecca's name, Patricia replied. Loan applications filed without her knowledge. There were also several instances where Mrs. Morrison, the petitioner, attempted to access accounts using Rebecca's social security number and personal information. Patterson objected strongly, but Judge Mitchell allowed the testimony to proceed. Patricia continued explaining that the private investigator's report documented not only identity theft involving me, but also a broader pattern of financial manipulation connected to several elderly individuals my mother had previously worked for in assistant roles. Mr. Morrison, Rebecca's grandfather, was particularly concerned, Patricia added. He mentioned that he had seen this pattern before in business situations, people using family relationships or positions of trust to gain access to assets that did not legally belong to them. He was determined to protect Rebecca from any attempt to manipulate her inheritance. The most significant revelation came when Patricia described additional measures my grandparents had taken. In their final months, she explained, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison established what they called a fraud protection protocol. They created detailed documentation of their decision-making process and recorded every interaction they had with family members concerning estate planning. She paused briefly and glanced toward me. They also recorded several conversations with Mrs. Morrison in which she clearly expressed her expectation to inherit everything. Judge Mitchell leaned forward. Recorded conversations? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia replied. Audio recordings made with Mrs. Morrison's knowledge and consent during family meetings about estate planning. Mr. Morrison was extremely careful about meeting all legal requirements. My heart seemed to stop for a moment. My grandparents had recorded my mother. Mr. Piton approached the witness stand holding a small digital device. Miss Henley, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit A-47. Can you identify it? Yes, Patricia said. It is one of the audio recordings Mr. Morrison made during a family meeting in his study about 8 months before his death. Mrs. Morrison had come to discuss the estate plan, and Mr. Morrison wanted to document exactly what was said. With the court's permission, Mr. Piton added, I would like to play a brief portion of that recording. Judge Mitchell nodded. Moments later, my mother's voice filled the courtroom. It was not the calm and concerned tone she had used in her testimony. Instead, it was sharp, impatient, and full of entitlement. Charles, this is ridiculous, her recorded voice said. You cannot seriously be considering leaving everything to Rebecca. She's 26 years old. What does she know about managing this kind of wealth or responsibility? My grandfather's voice responded calmly. Rebecca has demonstrated excellent judgment in every aspect of her life. Her academic accomplishments, professional success, and personal character all indicate that she is fully capable of managing family assets. Personal character? My mother's voice replied with a harsh laugh. She's barely part of this family. When does she visit? When does she call? She shows up for holidays and acts like she belongs here. But where was she when you needed her? When Eleanor was sick? My grandfather responded immediately. Rebecca was here every weekend during the 6 months of Eleanor's illness. She took leave from work to help with medical appointments. She researched treatment options and coordinated with doctors. Where were you, Sandra? There was a long silence in the recording. That's different, my mother finally said. I have my own life and responsibilities. But this inheritance, this is family money, Charles. Morrison family money. It should remain in the family. Rebecca is family, my grandfather answered. She is your daughter and our granddaughter. The inheritance should go to your children first, then grandchildren. That's how these things work. That's how proper families transfer wealth. Proper families, my grandfather replied quietly, make decisions based on character and capability, not just bloodlines. This conversation is finished, Sandra. The recording ended, leaving the courtroom completely silent. Patterson immediately stood up. Your Honor, this recording is highly prejudicial and taken out of context. Judge Mitchell interrupted him. Mr. Patterson, your client spent the last 2 days telling this court she was motivated by concern for Rebecca's welfare and the protection of family interests. He paused briefly. This recording strongly suggests that her real motivation is anger about not receiving assets she believed she deserved. How exactly is that taken out of context? There was no convincing response to that question. Patterson sat down without further comment. But Mr. Piton was not finished. Miss Henley, he asked, are there additional recordings? Yes, Patricia replied. Several, including one recorded 3 weeks before Mr. Morrison's death, in which Mrs. Morrison explicitly stated that she intended to challenge any will that did not list her as the primary beneficiary. The courtroom quickly filled with whispers. Judge Mitchell called for order, although it was clear he was also reacting to what he had heard. Your Honor, Mr. Piton said, I have 2 more brief recordings I would like the court to hear. They directly address the issue of Rebecca's competency. The first recording captured a conversation between my mother and my grandfather discussing my career at Morrison Financial. She's wasting her education, my mother's voice said, playing with other people's money instead of doing something meaningful with her life. How is that supposed to prepare her for real responsibility? My grandfather answered calmly. Sandra, Rebecca manages portfolios worth more than $30 million. Her clients trust her with their retirement savings, their children's education funds, and their entire financial future. If that is not real responsibility, I'm not sure what is. It's not the same as family money, my mother responded. Family wealth requires understanding heritage, tradition, social relationships, and community reputation. Rebecca treats money like numbers on a spreadsheet. Rebecca treats money with the careful respect it deserves, my grandfather replied. She understands that wealth is a tool to be managed wisely, not a status symbol to display carelessly. The second recording was even more damaging. Charles, you're being manipulated, my mother said, clearly frustrated. Rebecca is pretending to be the perfect granddaughter to secure her inheritance. Don't you see what she's doing? She's isolated you from your real family and made herself indispensable so she can inherit everything. It's classic elder manipulation. My grandfather's response was immediate and firm. Rebecca didn't isolate us from anyone. She is the only family member who maintained a genuine relationship with us. She visited regularly before Eleanor became ill, not just during emergencies. She called to share good news, not only when she needed something. She treated us like people she enjoyed spending time with, not like bank accounts. That's exactly what I'm saying, my mother replied. She's been preparing you for this. No, Sandra, my grandfather said quietly. She has simply been loving us. There's a difference. When the recording ended, my mother stared down at the floor, her face completely drained of color. Everything she had claimed in her testimony about concern for my well-being, about family loyalty, about protecting my interests, had been exposed as deliberate deception. Judge Mitchell leaned back in his chair and studied her with open disapproval. Mr. Patterson, he said finally, does your client wish to withdraw this petition? Patterson leaned toward my mother and spoke with her urgently for several minutes before responding. No, Your Honor. Regardless of Mrs. Morrison's motivations, we maintain that Rebecca still requires proper oversight when managing assets of this magnitude. It was a clear attempt to salvage the case. Judge Mitchell's expression suggested that it was already too late. Very well, he said. Mr. Piton, do you have additional evidence regarding Rebecca's competency? Just one more witness, Your Honor, Mr. Piton replied. I would like to call Rebecca Morrison. Taking the witness stand felt strange, as if I had stepped into a spotlight I had never wanted. I was suddenly required to defend abilities I had never expected to prove in court. The courtroom was full, and I could feel dozens of people watching as I swore to tell the truth. Mr. Swift-Payton began with straightforward questions designed to allow me to explain my actions clearly. Rebecca, you inherited approximately $8 million 18 months ago. Can you explain to the court how you have managed those assets? I had prepared carefully for this moment, organizing my documentation with the same precision I applied to managing client portfolios. I maintained the investment structure my grandparents established, I explained. It was already performing well. I made several adjustments to improve diversification and reduce overall risk exposure, but nothing speculative or extreme. Can you give the court specific examples? Certainly, I replied. I moved roughly 15% of the equity holdings into more conservative bond funds and treasury securities. I also established a charitable fund that mirrors my grandparents' philanthropic priorities. In addition, I allocated funds for ongoing property maintenance and tax obligations related to their real estate holdings. Have you made any significant personal purchases? Yes, I said. I purchased a vehicle to replace my college car, which had become unreliable. I also upgraded my apartment to something more appropriate for my income level, although I remained conservative with that investment. I have also continued my grandparents' tradition of supporting educational scholarship programs. Mr. Peaton nodded. Nothing in those decisions appears reckless or irresponsible. Could you explain your professional background for the court? This was the part I felt most confident discussing. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School and have worked at Morrison Financial for 4 years. I currently manage portfolios for 12 high net worth clients with combined assets totaling approximately $45 million. My performance reviews have consistently been excellent, and I have never received a client complaint or regulatory citation. Mr. Peaton continued. Rebecca, your mother testified that you isolated yourself from family and made financial decisions without consulting anyone. Is that accurate? I glanced briefly at my mother sitting at the plaintiff's table, her arms folded tightly. I consulted the same financial advisors my grandparents used. I worked with their estate attorney to ensure the transfers were handled correctly. I have also maintained professional relationships with several of their longtime business associates who understood their investment philosophy. The only family member I did not consult was my mother, I added calmly, because she had never shown interest in my financial decisions before. And frankly, I said, I did not trust her intentions. Can you explain what you mean by that? This was the moment I had been both anticipating and dreading. It was finally time to explain the truth about our family relationship, something meaningful with her life. How was that supposed to prepare her for real responsibility? Sandra, my grandfather replied calmly. Rebecca manages portfolios worth more than $30 million. Her clients trust her with their retirement savings, their children's college funds, and their entire financial futures. If that doesn't represent real responsibility, I'm not sure what does. It's not the same as family money. Family wealth requires an understanding of heritage, tradition, the value of maintaining social relationships, and community reputation. Rebecca treats money like it's just numbers on a spreadsheet. Rebecca treats money with the respect and careful analysis it deserves. She understands that wealth is a tool meant to be used wisely, not a symbol meant to be displayed carelessly. The second recording was even more damaging. Charles, you're being manipulated, my mother's voice said, tight with frustration. Rebecca is acting like the perfect granddaughter so she can secure her inheritance. Don't you see what she's doing? She's isolated you from your real family, made herself indispensable, and now she's positioned to inherit everything. It's textbook elder manipulation. My grandfather's response came quickly and firmly. Sandra, Rebecca didn't isolate us from anyone. She's the only family member who maintained a genuine relationship with us. She visited regularly before Eleanor became ill, not just during family emergencies. She called to share good news, not only when she needed something. She treated us like people she enjoyed spending time with, not like ATMs with interesting stories. That's exactly what I'm talking about. She's been preparing you for this. No, Sandra, she's been loving us. There's a difference. When the recording ended, my mother was staring at the floor, her face completely drained of color. Every word she had spoken in her testimony, about caring for my welfare, about protecting family bonds, about safeguarding my interests, had been revealed as calculated deception. Judge Mitchell leaned back in his chair and studied her with an expression of open disgust. Mr. Patterson, he finally said, does your client wish to withdraw this petition? Patterson leaned toward my mother and whispered urgently for several minutes before answering. No, Your Honor. We maintain that regardless of Mrs. Morrison's motivations, Rebecca still requires proper oversight for assets of this size. It was a desperate attempt to salvage something from the situation, but Judge Mitchell's expression made it clear that the strategy had come too late. Very well, he said. Mr. Hespeton, do you have additional evidence regarding Rebecca's competency? Just one more witness, Your Honor. I would like to call Rebecca Morrison herself. Taking the witness stand felt surreal, like stepping into a spotlight I had never wanted, forced to defend abilities I had never imagined I would need to prove. The courtroom was completely full, and I could feel dozens of eyes following my every movement as I swore to tell the truth. Piton's questions were simple and direct, allowing me to tell my story without complicated legal language or strategic maneuvering. Rebecca, you inherited approximately $8 million 18 months ago. Can you explain to the court what you've done with that inheritance? I had prepared carefully for this moment, organizing my thoughts and documents with the same discipline I used when managing client portfolios. I maintained the investment structure my grandparents originally established, which was already performing well. I made a few adjustments to increase diversification and reduce risk exposure, but nothing dramatic or speculative. Can you provide specific examples? Certainly. I moved about 15% of the equity holdings into more conservative bond funds and treasury securities. I created a separate charitable giving fund that reflects my grandparents' philanthropic interests. I also set aside funds for property maintenance and taxes related to the real estate holdings. Have you made any major purchases? I purchased a vehicle to replace my college car, which had become unreliable. I also upgraded my apartment to something more appropriate for my income level, though I kept the investment conservative, and I continued my grandparents' tradition of supporting educational scholarships. None of that sounds reckless or irresponsible. Can you tell the court about your professional background? This was where I felt most confident. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School and have worked at Morrison Financial for 4 years. I currently manage portfolios for 12 high net worth clients with combined assets of approximately $45 million. My performance reviews have always been excellent, and I've never had a client complaint or regulatory issue. Rebecca, your mother testified that you isolated yourself from family and made these financial decisions without consulting anyone. Is that accurate? I glanced briefly at my mother sitting at the plaintiff's table, her arms crossed and her jaw set rigidly. I consulted the same financial advisors my grandparents worked with. I coordinated with their estate attorney to ensure every transfer was handled properly. I've also maintained relationships with several of their longtime business associates who understood their investment philosophy. The only family member I didn't consult was my mother, because she had never shown interest in my financial decisions before. And frankly, I didn't trust her motivations. Can you explain what you mean by that? This was the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated. The opportunity to finally speak honestly about our family dynamic without worrying about diplomacy or preserving relationships that had never truly existed. My mother abandoned me when I was 7 years old, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. She left me with my grandparents and built a life that did not include regular contact with her daughter. For 21 years, she treated me like an obligation she acknowledged occasionally, rather than a child she genuinely wanted in her life. I noticed several people in the gallery nodding, and even Judge Mitchell's expression softened slightly. When my grandparents died and left their estate to me, my mother suddenly developed intense interest in my welfare and financial decisions. This wasn't maternal concern. It was anger that she hadn't inherited the money she believed she deserved, combined with an opportunity to gain control of those assets through legal manipulation. Patterson stood to object, but Judge Mitchell waved him down. The witness may continue. Your Honor, my mother didn't even know my birthday when she testified yesterday. She cannot name my college major, my employer, or any of my professional achievements. She has never visited my apartment, never met any of my friends, and could not describe basic details about my life. Yet she is asking this court to believe she is qualified to make decisions about my financial future. I opened a folder I had prepared specifically for this moment. I brought documentation to prove my competency, but honestly, I believe the burden of proof should be reversed. Anyone seeking to remove legal rights from another adult should have to demonstrate extraordinary circumstances that justify such an action. My mother hasn't even shown that she knows me well enough to make those judgments. Mr. Peetson nodded. Rebecca, if this court grants your mother conservatorship over your assets, what do you believe will happen? I believe she would gradually drain the accounts for her own benefit, just as she has been using my identity for years through fraudulent credit applications and unauthorized financial activity. The difference is that this time it would be legal because the court would have given her permission to control my finances. One final question, he said. Do you want a relationship with your mother? The question caught me by surprise, and I felt tears forming despite my determination to stay composed. I wanted that relationship for 28 years. I kept hoping she would decide I was worth her time and attention. But I've learned that you can't force people to love you, and you cannot build genuine relationships through manipulation and financial control. I paused and looked directly at my mother for the first time since taking the stand. If my mother wanted to be part of my life, she could have called me on my birthday. She could have visited my apartment. She could have asked about my career, my interests, or anything about who I am as a person. Instead, she hired lawyers to try to take my inheritance. That tells me everything I need to know about her priorities. When I finished speaking, the courtroom fell completely silent. Patterson chose not to cross-examine me, likely realizing that any additional questions would only reinforce the picture I had already presented of our family situation. Judge Mitchell called for a short recess. As I returned to the defendant's table, I felt something I had never experienced before: the certainty that I had spoken my truth honestly and completely without trying to protect anyone's feelings or maintain illusions about family loyalty. Whatever happened next, I had finally stood up for myself. Judge Mitchell returned to the bench only 15 minutes later. His expression was grim, and his posture suggested he had reached a decision that disturbed him deeply. I have presided over family court proceedings for 23 years, he began, his voice firm with authority. During that time, I have witnessed every kind of family dispute imaginable: custody battles, inheritance conflicts, and competency hearings involving individuals who truly required protection. This case is unlike anything I have encountered. He looked directly at my mother, who sat rigidly with her hands tightly clasped. Mrs. Morrison, you presented this court with a petition claiming your daughter is incompetent to manage her inheritance. The evidence presented during this hearing proves exactly the opposite. Rebecca Morrison is not only capable of managing her assets, but has demonstrated exceptional judgment, professional expertise, and careful consideration in every financial decision she has made. He paused briefly to review his notes before continuing. More troubling, however, is the evidence that your petition was motivated not by concern for your daughter's well-being, but by anger over being excluded from your parents' will. The court heard audio recordings of conversations where you explicitly stated that you believed you should have inherited these assets and that you intended to challenge any will that did not benefit you directly. Patterson began to stand, but the judge raised his hand to stop him. I am not finished. The court has also heard extensive testimony regarding fraudulent financial activity conducted in your daughter's name over several years. Credit accounts opened without her knowledge. Loan applications submitted using her personal information. A pattern of identity theft that continued even while you were preparing to file this competency petition. My mother's face had turned completely pale, and her hands were visibly shaking. Mrs. Morrison, by submitting financial records as evidence in this proceeding, you have inadvertently provided documentation of your own criminal conduct. Therefore, the court is taking several actions today. Judge Mitchell's voice became stronger and more decisive. First, the petition for conservatorship is denied in its entirety. Rebecca Morrison has full legal capacity to manage her assets, and this court finds no evidence whatsoever that would justify removing that capacity. A wave of relief washed over me so strongly that I nearly began crying at the defense table. Second, all financial records and documentation submitted during this proceeding will be forwarded to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of possible criminal fraud charges. The evidence suggests a pattern of identity theft and financial manipulation that extends beyond this family dispute. My mother made a quiet sound of distress while Patterson began frantically writing notes. Third, due to the frivolous nature of this petition and the apparent bad faith motivations behind it, Mrs. Morrison will be responsible for all court costs and reasonable attorney fees incurred by the defendant. But Judge Mitchell was not finished. Finally, I want to address something that deeply concerns me about this entire proceeding. He looked directly at my mother. Mrs. Morrison, you abandoned your daughter when she was 7 years old. You maintained minimal contact with her throughout her childhood and early adulthood. You provided no financial support, no meaningful guidance, and no real parental involvement in her life. His tone grew sharper. Yet when she inherited assets from the grandparents who actually raised her, you suddenly developed intense concern for her welfare. This court finds that behavior not only hypocritical, but morally reprehensible. You are not entitled to control or benefit from assets you did nothing to help create, manage, or preserve. My mother was crying now, though the tears were clearly driven by rage and frustration rather than remorse. Judge Mitchell stood, and the entire courtroom rose with him. Miss Morrison, he said, addressing me directly, you have demonstrated remarkable grace and dignity throughout this ordeal. Your grandparents chose their heir wisely. This court wishes you success in managing your inheritance and building the life you deserve. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted into conversation. Reporters were already typing rapidly on their phones, and several members of the financial community approached to shake my hand and offer support. But I barely noticed any of it. I was watching my mother as Patterson helped her gather her papers with trembling hands. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of her true intentions and the complete collapse of her legal strategy. Part of me felt sorry for her. Part of me considered walking over and trying to salvage something from the remains of our relationship. But the stronger part of me, the part shaped by years of disappointment and rejection, felt only relief that it was finally over. As she walked toward the courtroom exit, my mother paused and turned back. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the distance that had always existed between us. I thought she might say something, an apology, an explanation, or at least an acknowledgement of what she had put me through. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin with the same artificial pride I remembered from childhood, and walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. Mr. Piton was collecting documents and accepting congratulations from colleagues, but I remained seated at the defendant's table for several minutes, trying to process everything that had just happened. It was over. The inheritance was secure. The legal threats were gone, and I was free to build whatever life I wanted without constantly looking over my shoulder. But more importantly, the truth had finally been heard. A judge, a courtroom full of witnesses, and the public record now contained the reality of our family dynamic. I wasn't the ungrateful daughter who manipulated her grandparents. I wasn't an incompetent heir who needed protection from her own decisions. I was exactly who my grandparents believed I was, someone who had earned her inheritance through character, capability, and genuine love. 3 months later, I received notification that the state attorney general had filed criminal charges against my mother for identity theft and financial fraud. She eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a long trial and received 3 years of supervised probation, along with restitution requirements for the fraudulent accounts. I never heard from her again. The inheritance eventually allowed me to start my own financial planning firm, specializing in helping families manage complex wealth transfers without destroying their relationships. It is deeply satisfying work, helping people avoid the mistakes my family made and ensuring financial decisions are guided by merit rather than manipulation. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more real stories about family, money, and the courage it takes to stand up for yourself. Sometimes the best thing you can do with toxic family members is refuse to enable their behavior, no matter how difficult it feels emotionally. Because in the end, you cannot change people who do not want to change, but you can absolutely refuse to let them destroy your life in the process.